Hey there, ready to go into recover. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a single episode of the true crime podcast, Anatomy of Murder. It's the story of Elliot Dickerson, a young man murdered in 1990 in Stanton, Virginia. But what makes this case so unique is that the story is told from the perspective of Jen Escu, the very first full-time female undercover agent for the Virginia State Police. Here's the twist. She was actually the intended target of the gang responsible for Elliot's death.
Yes, it's a chilling example of mistaken identity with incredibly high stakes. What we'll uncover is how a community grappling with the crack cocaine epidemic, the dangers of undercover work, and the impulsive actions of a few individuals led to this tragic outcome.
Okay, so let's rewind back to Stanton, Virginia in the late 80s, early 90s. It's important to understand the context, right?
Yeah.
What was the scene like back then?
It was a tough time. The arrival of crack cocaine had really hit smaller communities hard. And Stanton was no exception. Increased violence, robberies, you name it. Law enforcement was struggling to keep up.
And that's where Jen Escu enters the picture. But her path to becoming an undercover agent is pretty fascinating. She actually started out with a degree in therapeutic recreation, working in a nursing home. Quite a shift, wouldn't you say?
It really is. She's described her desire for a role that felt bigger than herself, something more impactful. And her father was a key figure in this decision, encouraging her to pursue law enforcement. It's interesting, though, because she initially had doubts about whether the Virginia State Police would even hire women at that time.
That makes her father's support even more impactful,
Mm.
especially given the era. So she joins the Virginia State Police in '86, and boom, just 3 years later, she's offered this incredible opportunity to become their first full-time female undercover agent. Talk about breaking barriers.
And her undercover assignments were surprisingly diverse. For example, she even spent time as bait for a suspected serial killer known as the Colonial Parkway Killer or Lover's Lane Murderer. She would literally spend hours pretending to make out with a stranger in a car, all while being recorded. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that?
Wow, that's intense. But her assignment in Stanton was different. This is about infiltrating the local drug scene, posing as both a buyer and a seller to build cases against the gangs operating there. To do that, she had to create a whole new persona. Going by the name Jamie Lee Baylor, Lee for short, it's like something out of a movie.
It's easy to romanticize undercover work, but the reality is that maintaining that double life takes a huge toll. Think about the constant fear of being recognized, the pressure to perform convincingly, and the emotional detachment required to navigate that world. It's a high-stakes game with very real dangers.
And she couldn't exactly walk around with a badge and a notepad. How did she even keep track of everything?
She had to be incredibly resourceful. She'd use a tiny notebook hidden in her jacket to jot down details about drug buys, and carefully placed each purchased baggie into separate pockets to keep them organized. This wasn't some Hollywood spy thriller. This was real-life undercover work with real risks.
From what I understand, she was focused on 3 main gangs in Stanton. There were the Beeper Boys, so-called because they used pagers to communicate, another gang focused on gun running, and then there was the notorious Papa Ford gang.
Yes, Papa Ford, whose real name was Lee Rosa Ford Sr., led that gang. But what made them particularly dangerous was that so many of his children, mostly sons, were actively involved in the drug trade. They were raised in a culture of violence, which added a whole other layer of complexity and danger for Jen.
And they were the hardest for her to crack. She couldn't even get inside their house. She had to rely on an informant to approach Papa Ford just to make a buy. Talk about a slow burn, working her way up the chain like that.
It's a reminder that these investigations take time and meticulous planning. Jen couldn't just waltz in and demand to meet the kingpin. She had to earn their trust, starting with smaller buys and gradually becoming a more significant player in their eyes.
It sounds incredibly dangerous. And that trust she was working so hard to build started to crumble, didn't it? Papa Ford became suspicious of her and her informant, Jimmy. There were rumors that they might be snitches, which is a death sentence in that world.
This growing suspicion is where things take a dark turn. Was Jen's cover blown? How much danger was she really in? We'll delve into that next.
So the situation's getting tense. Jen's noticing that the Ford boys are suddenly refusing to sell to her. Were there any other signs that things were about to go sideways?
Yes, and those signs were incredibly concerning. One chilling anecdote Jen shared involved Papa Ford's 13-year-old son. She overheard him saying, "Somebody gonna die, somebody gonna pay." That's a pretty clear indication that violence was imminent.
That's terrifying. A 13-year-old talking about death and retribution like that. It speaks volumes about the environment they were raised in. So what happens next? Does Jen manage to get out?
Well, she tries to. She frantically attempts to contact her topside agent, the person on the outside who's responsible for her safety and the overall operation. But communication was spotty at best, and that's when she gets a chilling update. Her topside agent tells her about a shooting in Stanton. A young man gunned down by a group of teenagers in a small red vehicle.
And she immediately suspects the Ford gang, right?
Absolutely. The description matched them perfectly. But here's the thing. The timeline doesn't quite add up. The shooting occurred just 30 minutes after Jen last saw the Ford boys. So if they were supposedly targeting her, why was this other young man, Elliot Dickerson, the victim? It's a case of mistaken identity, but the motive is initially unclear.
This is where it gets really confusing for me. If they suspected Jen Jason, why not target her directly? Why go after someone else?
It's a question that haunted investigators for a while, but as they dug deeper, they discovered another layer to this tragic story. It turns out that Keith Scott, a local high school basketball star who was with Elliot that night, was actually the intended target.
Hold on. How did Keith get caught up in all of this? He doesn't seem to have any connection to the Ford gang or Jen's undercover work.
The answer lies with Cleon Ford, the 15-year-old son of Papa Ford we mentioned earlier. Remember how the gang was known for its volatile nature, especially the younger members? Well, earlier that evening, Cleon got into a fight at a local pizza place, and things escalated quickly. Not only did he lose the fight, but he also dropped a bag containing over $3,000 worth of crack cocaine.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt. Losing a fight is one thing, but losing that much crack, that's a huge financial hit and a major blow to his ego.
Exactly, and Cleon was already known for his short fuse. Humiliated and furious, he told his brothers what had happened, and together they decided to take matters into their own hands.
So instead of targeting the guys who beat him up, they end up targeting Keith and Elliot. How did that happen?
It seems like a tragic case of mistaken identity fueled by rage and a desire for immediate revenge. Elliot just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, driving a car similar to one of the guys involved in Cleon's fight. Remember, this wasn't a carefully planned hit. Witnesses describe a chaotic scene with yelling and guns being pointed. Elliot, caught completely off guard, had no idea why he was being targeted. Tragically, despite not being the intended target, he was shot multiple times at point-blank range. The violence was swift and merciless.
And what about Keith? Did he manage to escape?
Miraculously, yes. Despite witnessing his best friend's murder, Keith was able to run to safety. But imagine the trauma of that experience. It's a wound that likely never fully heals.
You're right. The psychological impact of witnessing such a horrific act of violence is unimaginable. And what about Jen? How did she react when she learned what had happened?
Devastated. Even though she wasn't physically harmed, she couldn't escape the overwhelming guilt knowing that she was the intended target and that her investigation had indirectly led to Elliot's death. It's a heavy burden to carry.
Yeah. I can't even imagine to dedicate yourself to fighting crime, to put your life on the line, only to have it result in the death of an innocent person. That has to be incredibly difficult to process. But it's important to remember that Jen played a crucial role in solving this case. She didn't let the guilt paralyze her. She provided the police with critical information about the Ford brothers, their vehicle, and the potential motive behind the shooting, which led to their swift arrests.
You're right. It's a testament to her strength and dedication. Without her insights, the investigation could have easily stalled. Her undercover work, while indirectly leading to tragedy, ultimately helped bring Elliot's killers to justice.
So while justice was served, it came at an incredibly high cost. Elliot's death cast a long shadow over Stanton, a chilling reminder of the destructive power of drugs, gangs, and impulsive violence.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of our choices. Elliot's innocent decision to spend time with his friend, Cleon's impulsive act of revenge, Jen's courageous decision to go undercover. These seemingly disparate choices converged in a devastating and irreversible way.
It's a stark reminder that even in the pursuit of justice, there can be unintended consequences. And those consequences can be profound and heartbreaking. It really makes you think about the domino effect of choices, doesn't it? One seemingly small event can trigger a chain reaction that leads to devastating consequences.
Exactly. And this case really highlights the complexities of gang culture. These weren't just hardened criminals. They were young men, some still teenagers, caught in a cycle of violence and poverty. Cleon's reaction to losing that fight, his need to retaliate. It speaks to the distorted values and lack of conflict resolution skills that are often ingrained in these environments.
It's a stark contrast to the world most of us live in. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine reacting with deadly force over a fistfight and some lost drugs. It's a
Yeah.
completely different mindset, a different reality.
Right. And it underscores the urgent need for intervention and support systems in these communities. How do we break these cycles of violence? How do we provide young people with alternative paths, with the skills and resources they need to make different choices? These are questions we need to grapple with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the aftermath. What happened to the Ford brothers and the others involved in Elliot's murder?
Well, within 24 hours of the shooting, law enforcement launched a full-scale manhunt. Thankfully, the information Jen provided was instrumental in identifying the suspects and their vehicle. Most of the Ford crew was apprehended quite quickly, and firearms matching the descriptions were recovered.
It sounds like Jen's knowledge of the local drug scene and her connections within those circles were essential in breaking this case open.
Absolutely. If not for her undercover work, it's very possible this case could have gone cold. Think about it. Keith, understandably traumatized, didn't know the assailants. And there's often a code of silence surrounding these types of crimes within gangs. Jen was the key to piecing together what happened and holding those responsible accountable.
So justice was swift. But what were the specific outcomes for those involved?
Cleon Wilson, the 15-year-old who fired the fatal shots, took a plea deal and received a 40-year sentence. Two of his older brothers, Michon and Tyrone, also pled guilty and were sentenced to 20 years each. Another member of the group, John Bostic, had his charges dropped. And the fifth person in the car that night, Lorenzo Williams, was never found.
It's a mix of accountability and some unanswered questions. What about John Bostic? Why were his charges dropped?
That's something that wasn't explained in the episode. It's possible there wasn't enough evidence to directly tie him to the crime, or perhaps he cooperated with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence.
And what about Jen and her partner? What happened to them after the operation was shut down?
Their world was turned upside down. Both of them had to go into hiding for their safety. They had to essentially disappear from the lives they had built undercover, because the Ford gang, despite the arrests, was still considered a threat.
It's a reminder of the unseen sacrifices undercover officers make. Not only do they risk their lives during an operation, but they often have to deal with the psychological and emotional fallout long after it's over. Uprooting their lives, severing ties with the identities they created, that has to be incredibly difficult.
It is. But even though their undercover operation ended abruptly, the evidence they gathered resulted in the largest drug bust the Shenandoah Valley had ever seen at that time.
So even amidst the tragedy, their work had a significant impact on the community. It wasn't just about catching the perpetrators of this one crime. It was about disrupting the drug trade, making the streets safer for everyone.
It's a complicated story, that's for sure. It forces us to confront the harsh realities of the drug trade, the devastating consequences of impulsive violence, and the sacrifices law enforcement officers make to try to protect communities.
This deep dive has really been a journey. We've gone from the adrenaline-fueled world of undercover operations to the heartbreaking reality of mistaken identity and the ripple effects of a single act of violence.
And we've seen how these events impacted so many lives. Elliot Dickerson, whose life was tragically cut short. Keith Scott, who will forever carry the trauma of witnessing his friend's murder. And Jen Escu, who dedicated herself to fighting crime, but had to grapple with the unintended consequences of her work.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. How often do we make assumptions about others based on limited information on appearances, on what we think we know? Elliot Dickerson was judged based on those assumptions. He was mistaken for someone else in the wrong place at the wrong time, and ultimately paid the ultimate price for a crime he didn't commit.
It's a chilling reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of seeking understanding before passing judgment. In a world that often rushes to conclusions, it's more crucial than ever to pause, listen, and strive for empathy.
To challenge our own biases, to recognize the complexity of human experiences, and to remember that everyone has a story worth hearing. It's about choosing compassion over judgment, understanding over assumptions, and working together to create a world where tragedies like Elliot's become less likely, not more.